Mm. Mm.
Check, check.
It's just like, you know. Shit.
Hi, if you're on Zoom, please make sure to stay muted unless you're asked to speak.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our committee. This is the working group to address veterans' grave upkeep. I'm Mike Frieda, one of the co-chairs. I'd like to start from my left, your right, to have our committee members introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, John Carragher with the State of Connecticut Department of Veterans Affairs.
Good afternoon, Maureen Magnan, Department of Consumer Protection.
Good afternoon, John Carmen, Carmen Funeral Homes.
Ron Shea, Connecticut Cemetery Association.
Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Do we have anyone on Zoom here this afternoon? Okay.
Cheryl Jansen, Attorney Cheryl Jansen, invited by Judge Carmen Lopez.
How are you, Cheryl?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good.
Ray Baldwin, also invited by Carmen Lopez.
Ray, how are you?
Good, Mike. How are you?
Long time, haven't seen you. Hope all's well.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Is Jamie Cosgrove on? Okay, we'll get started. I'm going to turn it over to John here. Before this meeting started, John has done a lot of research since our last meeting, and I've asked him to give us an update as to what his updates look like for those watching on TV, members of the public here, and for this committee. John?
Thanks, Mike. I did a lot of phone calls to both cemeteries, probate courts, and also to an old friend, Arch Weathers, who had owned and still does the Dunham Company that had listings of cemeteries throughout New England, specifically Connecticut. It was his work had been referenced by a report back in the 1990s by actually some legislative research work, just to see the scope of the cemeteries that there are. It's approximately 1,000 cemeteries in the state of Connecticut, of which there are maybe 250 or so that would be part of ecclesiastical societies, i.e. church or in some way religious organizations owned and run. Another about 200 were municipal cemeteries that were owned and controlled by the communities that they were in. And the balance, were small private association cemeteries that probably fell under the 501c13 statute for public burial grounds. Also check to see, because over the years there had been requirements that these forms, minutes of their meetings would be filed annually. The annual meeting minutes would be filed annually, many to the probate courts. And I did find that quite a few did that. Also that their tax returns, their nonprofit tax returns that showed obviously income and where their funds were spent, that they were also filed. And that there was some provisions where that if people had any problems or wanted to view those, that they could request that of the probate court, and that the probate court could authorize the release of that information. But there were also several probate judges that actually didn't really even remember receiving anything. But I talked to some folks that ran cemeteries that I knew were very well run, both in Litchfield, Tolland, Hartford County, and found that they were doing everything that it seemed that they were supposed to do, and maybe even more. They were also cemeteries that, from my experience and being in cemeteries probably more than most people, that they also did a very good job of addressing problems. And that if there was a family that had a complaint about maybe the way a grave or a gravestone was taken care of, that most of those people either contacted a local funeral director, who then spoke to the cemetery, or they went to the cemetery directly. So while there are going to be a lot of small cemeteries that are out there that may not have, the kind of supervision and oversight that some of the larger or well-managed ones do, is part of the scope of the problem that we're facing.
Ron?
In regard to that estimate or database of 1,000 cemeteries in Connecticut, that's probably a gross underestimate. The Find a Grave website lists 2,450 cemeteries in Connecticut.
Wow.
And that's volunteer run. So that's probably also an underestimate.
John, any comments? Okay, Maureen? So after listening to what John reported here, it really enhances what we have begun to identify as a high level of fragmentation across the state on these issues. Now, I mentioned in a previous meeting here, as North Haven's chief elected official, we have our own municipal cemeteries. We hire out contractors to manage and manicure those cemeteries. I am also able to augment their efforts. They come in once a month with our Public Works Department. And if in the event there's a hurricane or tornado where a stone is tumbled over, or there's trees that are littering the cemetery, it's either North Haven's Public Works or these contractors whom we hire. I'd like to think that most municipalities do the same thing. All Saints Cemetery in North Haven, I mentioned this the last time, a good example. People are very happy there. Well done, well groomed, well manicured. We don't seem to have any problems there. So this group is charged with the responsibility of coming up with a process, a plan to present to the General Assembly. And I see one of the biggest challenges of this group is how to manage through the fragmentation and the complexity of that, so that all of the people who have loved ones in these cemeteries have a voice to address their concerns. Now, Cheryl, who's on this call in public comment, I may ask her to comment. She presented me with a unique thought that I thought had a lot of merit. It was about an app. And apparently some cemeteries have a lot of information I'm going to ask Cheryl to comment on that during public comment. So with that being said, this group has been extended. The original legislation required us to submit a recommendation by January 1st. So we have been extended for as long as it takes through the end of this year to come up with a plan. And through this extension, the plan would be somewhere in the late fall. We have to come up with this plan and present it to the General Assembly for the next session next year. I had thought that maybe if there was a plan that we can formulate, should we get it into this session? It's a shorter session. That there's upside and downside to that. The upside is if we had a plan, there would be a bill created in legislation, perhaps created to be voted on by the General Assembly. The downside to that, in a short session, there's a lot of bills and it might not get acted upon. On the other side of it, by being extended, we have a lot more time to develop something, but it's another year away. Because at that point, under the way we're operating right now, if we submit a plan by January of next year, it wouldn't take place if it even got voted on until the fiscal year beginning July 1st. So I'm kind of going back and forth in my mind on what the right approach is. But as of right now, because we're nowhere near creating any recommendations, we just have to go with the plan and continue to work over the next several months to try to develop something. Any thoughts on that? Ron?
I would just agree that it's very complicated, not something we can rush into with hopes of having something to present to the current legislature. Too many open questions that would be left unanswered, other than, we need, it's the charge of the group is strictly to develop a process. And it remains to be seen what that process would look like, who's going to be in charge of it, who's going to follow up, all those kinds of questions that, in the time remaining in the session, probably can't be answered properly.
And this process, ladies and gentlemen, for those watching, also revolves around giving the people a voice. And the question is, where does that voice lie? Or to whom does that voice go? And, we've talked about the Department of Health, the Department of Consumer Protection. But if one of those becomes the repository for the voices of the people, then those agencies, I believe, would have to staff up and add additional resources. So, like Ron said, the legislation is clear that established us. We have to come up with a process, and the process should also revolve around giving the people a voice. So I think from this point forward, we have some people here today. We have Cheryl on Zoom. I think it's important we hear what some of the other opinions are to maybe help us create this process. John?
I agree. And just back to Ron's comments about that there are a lot more. I think the numbers that I was giving are really the active cemeteries, and that there may be a great number of inactive cemeteries, or that are not being used at all. Small, even Revolutionary War cemeteries or private grounds. Years ago, individual Jewish congregations would have their own space. Some of those cemeteries aren't even as large as this room. And thankfully, like the Jewish Federation took over a lot of those small cemeteries where they never had people to do that. And that has been a huge plus for those that as an overarching group. And some towns have taken over the responsibility of some historic cemeteries. Again, because that was the right thing to do, and that their communities would take care of that, even though there's not any activity in those cemeteries and hasn't been for years. But also that begs the issue that are those or some of those going to be a problem in the future, because there is no one to go to. concern.
This group has been presented a lot of information, Mr. Ed Zach in particular. We saw some more information today. So I think where we are at this point is that this group has a clear understanding of what the problems are. But it's a matter of, like I mentioned earlier, how do we address the fragmentation and create a process to give the people the voice? And the story that John just told is such that these unattended cemeteries that are so far fragmented out from any jurisdiction, how do we address those cemeteries also? So I'm at the point, ladies and gentlemen, on this working group that, to summarize, we know what the problems are. I'd like to hear more about what the solutions would be from maybe some people here today, particularly Cheryl, whom I mentioned, because we have to, I believe, start formulating over the next several months, at least the foundation and the core of what our recommendations will be from a process standpoint in developing that process. For those watching for the first time, I want to be clear that this group is charged with developing a process. This group has no authority to now intervene on any individual problems that we may see in any cemeteries. We have no authority on that, ladies and gentlemen. Our charge is to develop a plan, present it, and let the General Assembly vote on it. Any other comments from committee members?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
just a concern that was raised in the original hearings of the original Senate Bill 642, I believe, that both the Commissioner of Consumer Protection and Veterans Affairs at the time testified that they had reservations about focusing solely on veterans' graves, the exclusion of, quote, ordinary, unquote, consumers. And there is a question, I'm not an attorney, the question will the courts might end up being involved in this if we establish a procedure only for veterans' graves, if someone who's a relative of someone not a veteran might say that that is discriminatory.
Yeah. Okay, John, Maureen, anything?
So I think it's a concern, and I think the concern is well-founded in that the majority of cemeteries do not have separate veterans sections where you can clearly define that this is the section, this section is reserved for veterans and their family members. So I think that is a concern. And it's also, besides a possible legal question, I think it's also a practical question in that let's just say you've got site number 1 and site number 2 right next to each other, and both are in disrepair, for just pick a word. Would it be our charge and part of our plan to go in and, in however the method is, and I'm not making a statement on that, to improve site 1 and not improve site 2? It doesn't pass the practicality test. So I think it's a significant concern.
Yeah, I would agree. And I also think when we're dealing with the neglected cemeteries, I'm not exactly sure how we approach it. If you were to ask either of our agencies to oversee it, there's no way to enforce it because there's nobody that's running or looking over the cemetery. So I'm not sure. I don't have a solution to that. And I think I don't know if that's our biggest problem is the neglected cemeteries, but it seems we need some sort of solution for that, just so we can enforce whatever.
Right. And that therein lies kind of what I referenced earlier, Maureen, is that if we decide that there's a recommendation to give the people a voice and the people then have a voice, but there's no follow-up. And that
And I mean, either
compounds.
one of our agencies can take in the complaints, but when there's nobody to go to, and enforce them to clean up the cemeteries, I don't think we're helping the consumer that much.
And the only way around that potentially would be if the agencies were to identify the resources they needed from the state to staff up to help solve the problem. And I'm not sure if that can be done.
Well, I mean, we could certainly staff up to take in the calls and do all of that, but the actual maintenance of the graves, I think, is the issue.
John?
And I just wanted to go back to what we talked about earlier is that, you know, there is a process for municipalities to apply for grants to work on this issue. I don't know that what we're trying to do lends itself to the macro solution. In other words, if whatever agency receives the complaint, and well-founded complaint, I am sure, you know, to take it to its illogical conclusion. So then that agency turns around and has an open contract with a vendor to go out and do that work. That doesn't pass the make sense test. It doesn't pass the economy of scales test. It makes no sense at all. And I'm just throwing things out there as to what would happen. So, you know, whatever agency would receive those complaints, okay, fine. And I think to Maureen's point, what do I do with it? You know, do I refer it back to the municipality? Do I compile a report that needs to fill an empty manila folder every year? I don't know. But if there's neither a stick nor a carrot at this point. So I think that's, I think that's part of the issue. I do think that at the end of the day, a couple things need to happen before we move forward. First and foremost, we've got a number between 1,000 and 4,000 cemeteries that might be out there. Right. And I don't know what, Find a Grave says that it is. Well, is it bigger than a breadbasket? So we don't know that answer. So I think at some level we need to get to the municipalities, and yourself as a first selectman, right, sir?
Yes.
How many cemeteries do you have in your municipality? I mean, that's the level of detail that we don't know. And, who owns it? What would you say the condition of it is? And and that kind of stuff. So then we can kind of scope the problem, right? And then if we come up with 169 towns and 169 municipalities in Connecticut, and again, I'm just making stuff up at this point. So 60 of those chief elected officials say, yeah, I've got cemeteries in my municipality that need attention. It's specifically towards veterans' graves. Now, that's another subset of the previous problem that we talked about. How we get past that, I don't know. Well, did you know, first selectman or mayor, that there is a grant program that is available for you to get resources in order to address this problem?
Mhm.
And then the ask back to the legislature there is, hey, we have identified, and again, making stuff up, we've identified 60 municipalities that have identified 72 cemeteries that need attention, and the municipalities estimate that it's going to cost X number of dollars. And then we move from there, from the grant process to put the dollars into the hands of the municipalities to solve that problem there. Now, something else to consider though, as we do this, is, overgrown cemeteries, after you cut them back, start overgrowing again. So that's a follow-on, a follow-on problem because we can fix it once, but fixing the underlying issue that there is no, there is no care going on, no maintenance, preventative maintenance going on, is another complete question, that would really be a follow-on to this whole process. We haven't even gotten there yet. If we went doom and they're all fixed, the next day they start getting bad again. So, something else to consider, sir.
Well, that is, a very good observation, a series of observations, John. And here's the question. So through the municipal grant program, and I know First Selectman Jamie Cosgrove, I think, was part of that years ago. Not sure if he's on here now, but if we are able to create the voice through the legislation, let's say it's the Department of Consumer Protection. They don't have the resources, we know that. But they contact a municipality then under the scenario that you're both kind of suggesting here. And the municipality then identifies what the cost would be. But then how do we close the loop on an unattended cemetery, let's say, or a Catholic cemetery? How would the grant program work with that, John?
So if I'm not mistaken, and John Carmen may be able to correct me, but there is language currently in statute that allows the municipalities to do work in unattended or unowned cemeteries for and I don't know the exact right term, but irregardless, whether or not anybody is in charge of it, again, back to the beginning of the question, the chief elected official or the town manager or whatever knows that there's 8 cemeteries in their town, regardless of who owns them. He or she knows. Other than, you're always going to miss the family plots in small pieces of land that are privately held or whatever, but greater than, I think the statute says 10 or 12, something like that, graves in one location consists of a cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
I think until such time as we have some idea of what that scope of the problem is and kind of what the assessment is at the local level of the conditions, we don't have any idea of how to move forward. It's really easy to say, okay, we need additional funding into the neglected cemetery grant program, which I don't even know what the source of the funding is anyways. But let's just say, okay, I'll write you a check. How much you need? I don't know.
All right.
Because I don't know the scope of the problem.
All right, let's stay on that for a second because we're making some progress here with some of the comments that we have had here. So if we were to look at what the end game should be and then work backwards, and let's say the end game is we want to have the people have a voice, and let's just say hypothetically it's with the Department of Consumer Protection. We know up front they don't have the resources. They contact a municipality, someone like me or Mr. Cosgrove. And we then have a contractor go out to get a quote for the scope of the work. And then we have at least something to work with to apply for a grant. In the case of the Catholic cemeteries, of which we have no jurisdiction on, if that model would have to then include the communication with the Catholic cemetery to say that we're willing to hire the contractor, there's a grant program, but the contractor is going to work under your jurisdiction, not the municipality, because they know the cemetery better than we do. Does that make sense?
Could you say that again? What I thought I heard you say was that the contractor would work under the supervision of whatever state agency it is and not the municipality.
No, we're working under us. We would hire the contractor. We'd have a contractor go out and quote
We who?
municipality.
And that is already in place.
But I'm talking about for the cemeteries that are owned by like the Catholic cemetery. We don't have that plan right now. We can't go into a Catholic cemetery and hire a contractor, John, and get a quote and then just do the work. That's not the way that works. So I'm talking about tying the grant.
Well,
program.
and then I'm not disagreeing with you, sir, but I think in the scenario, and again, John might be able to shed a little light on this. I think in the scenario that you're talking about, you are unlikely to have a problem with someone that you don't have authority to go and work. In other words, if I went to the Diocese of Hartford and said, I need to, I've gotten 3 complaints from your cemetery here. I think the Diocese of Hartford and that active cemetery is going to fix that problem, as opposed to, you know what I'm saying? So I understand what you're saying for locations that you may or may not have authority to go and do work on. But I think those are places that you're not going to have a problem. John, I may be saying it wrong, but you know
No,
what I mean? Do you know what I mean?
No, I agree. And it's, they need the public, they need an advocate. They need somewhere that they can go that someone or some agency, whether it's one person that actually gets up to speed on being able to contact these individual cemeteries, because they're probably, I know that, Mr. Zach is obviously had a different experience, but you're going to get individual people who have got problems with a gravesite. And if there's somewhere that they can go and then get the information to reach the right people in those cemeteries and everything else, if we can facilitate that, that's a lot better. And if a town has a problem with a major part of an older cemetery, that to get the help, to get the grant and everything else so that work can be done, but they've got to be in charge of that. I don't think we want to be doing that or, having anybody outside. I had thought, there's a lot of around Memorial Day and Flag Day, Boy Scout troops, and there's volunteers and American Legion posts and VFW posts that go out and place American flags on veterans graves. And they do a phenomenal job of that. Sometimes they get missed. Some cemeteries actually have maps of veterans graves to make it easier for subsequent people, volunteers, to be able to do that. But when you ask those people to go a step further and say, we'd like you to bring some trimmers and trim around that stone and everything else, I'm sure there's some liability issues that a cemetery may have. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if people are doing work in there that are not either employees of the cemetery or, under those things, it's difficult. But the municipality would seem to me to be the closest place that would have more intimate knowledge about the cemeteries that they have in their town, and that would want them to be beautifully maintained. So they've got a reason for that.
Yeah, they've got a vested interest in making sure that
absolutely a vested
that it's right.
interest. And I think that as long as they even had someone, or if there was someone in an agency that was able to give them the information if they needed it for help, or who it is to contact, I would think that would be a good start. But if people get pushed, wrong word. But if people get moved from one agency to another, like it's not my responsibility, then the frustration is there. They're not going anywhere. And we've heard that from some of the folks that have tried to do things in the past.
Yep. But I also think that, and if anyone that knows me, I'm the last person that would advocate putting any kind of an additional burden on our municipalities from a mandate perspective. But I think that, like John said, who knows what's going on in their town better and has the ability to impact it, and that's the folks in their town, in that individual town, provided that if we at the state level have determined that it is such a problem that we need to increase the resources that are available from the town to provide to the towns to do that work. I just think if we put the more, I'll go back to what I said before, and that is solving a micro issue at the macro level is not always the best way to do it. I think that I'm very much, as I've thought more and more about this, that, you know, if I have a problem with the park in my town, I call my mayor. What, and then they do something, you know, within their resources to do that. That's why we have, you know, that's why we have town government to provide those things within the resources allocated by the taxpayers of the town, or in many cases, the taxpayers of the state. So I think by empowering the municipalities, and again, I'm not trying to push this off onto the towns, other than to say that I believe that they are in the best position to understand the problem and understand the solution in each town. What we can do at the state level, and don't get me wrong, I'm just throwing ideas out here. Okay. I'm not making any policy statements or nothing like that. But if we can help resource the municipalities to do that, that's an effective way for the state to get after the problem that was identified and that led to the creation of this working group.
All right. I think, I agree, but I'm going to turn it over to Ron. Go ahead, Ron.
2 points to Mr. Carmen's point about Boy Scouts and so on, and other volunteers who are very well intentioned. But besides the liability point, there's also a point of the expertise needed to properly address an issue. And sometimes they can create tripping hazards, whatever, because they're not professionals. So I think a lot of cemeteries would want to be overseeing the process of outsiders coming in and doing what they feel to be remedial work. The other point to what John was saying about the grants is, from the data we were given at the last meeting, it would appear that those grants are not guaranteed, that they were made in 2018 to about 50 municipalities at $2,500 each. In 2020, there were grants of $3,332 given to 37 municipalities. And in 2023, there were $5,000 grants to 41 municipalities. So it appears that it's not guaranteed every year. And even at the maximum level, $5,000, as you said, John, you could spend it on fixing things at a given point in time, and fast forward number of months during the height of the growing season, and their problems again. I think a lot of, and again, the legislation appears to be specifically focused on neglected cemeteries. I'm not sure how they were defined. Possibly the cemeteries that, you know,
There is a definition of
Right.
neglected cemetery in statute, and I do agree with you that, and you can also look at the municipalities that applied for and received the grants were often the same municipalities. So that leads me to question whether all 169 chief elected officials and their staffs knew that those grants were available. And then I could not determine, all the statute says is funds will be deposited from, I can't remember the exact word. It sounds like there's a fee somewhere that goes into this fund. I don't know what that fee is. So I am sure that the balance of the fund determines the number of the number of applicants that are approved at the level for which they are approved. But not knowing that, there's no, and there's also no way to tell if, and again, I'm not looking right at it, but if 40 grants were given, well, was that how many applied, or were there 60 that applied that 20 didn't get? There's no way of knowing that, from the publicly facing documents.
I do have a little information. A neglected cemetery is defined as cannot be under the control or management of any currently functioning cemetery association. And there's about $90,000 in the account right now, and it's called neglected cemetery account. And it's in the Office of Policy and Management.
So that 90,000, Maureen, is in the account right now as part of the grant program?
It's in the program. It's the part that's unallocated at this point. There's about 200,000 that's allocated out already.
I think then, based on that, John, and what Maureen's saying, and, you brought this up again, it's really good information about this municipal grant program that have to be part of our recommendations, the reinstatement of that plan, for 5 years, or whatever it may be, so we can help try to solve this problem.
Well, I don't know that I don't know that it's a matter of reinstatement. It's there.
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of making sure that, well, again, back to the beginning, is it bigger than a bread box? How many cemeteries are out there? And what is the assessed condition of said cemeteries by the chief elected officials?
Mhm.
Two, when they come back and tell us what that is, and maybe give us an estimate, and again, I'm making stuff up, maybe give us an estimate of how much it's going to take to bring it to a reasonable standard that can be maintained into the future, absent additional state funding, right? Because we're not going to own this forever, right? And then we look to, as part of our recommendations to the General Assembly, we look at an amount of funding over a period of time that may be applicable to help the municipalities help themselves.
All right, I think these are very good comments. So Ron, can I ask you a question then? Just, we're sort of formulating what a strategy should be. So as a municipal leader, I have no problem with accepting that responsibility. We're doing it now in North Haven, but it would just expand itself out through the grant program. But let's say the municipality had a complaint on a Catholic cemetery. But the municipality is willing to try to apply for a grant. John mentioned earlier, if we contacted the Archdiocese of Hartford, they probably would be on board with this. But do we start there, or do we go to the individual cemeteries? And how do we coordinate that at that point?
Again, not all, not only speak for Catholic cemeteries, but I know our association has several Jewish cemeteries, so we have to include those, or groups, other groups, Masons, whatever that may, they're truly ecclesiastical societies that do that. And so because not all, for instance, parish cemeteries are directly under the control, if you will, of the Archdiocesan Cemetery Association. Sometimes when parishes can no longer, their cemeteries have become inactive and they can't maintain them, there's no room to bury anyone anyways, they would turn them over to the Archdiocesan Cemetery Association. So if you look at the Archdiocesan website, you'll see a listing of those cemeteries that are, active and major cemeteries, and a whole list of others that are former parish cemeteries that have been turned over to them because there's no process, there's no ability. But I think, for our Archdiocesan cemeteries, that would be your point of first contact. But for parish cemeteries, point of first contact might be the parish themselves. Right. And even I think the word neglect, again, the charge of the committee, the wording in Special Act 2325 is the concerns regarding the upkeep of such deceased veterans' graves. What does the word upkeep mean? Does it mean mowing the grass and weed whacking, as they would do for the entire cemetery? Or does it involve something more extensive, depending on other characteristics. I think that some of the that neglected cemeteries grants talked about, fences that had fallen over, shrubs that were overgrown, those kinds of issues, and not necessarily specific graves. Because again, the markers themselves are the personal property of the families, whoever has placed it there. And the burial, the document that people get says they have the right to bury a body. That's all it says. They don't have ownership rights, but if they place a marker, yes, they own the marker.
Yeah.
And might have a problem if someone did something that they thought was corrective, but turned out to be deleterious.
Yeah.
So,
Just-
other question, what does upkeep mean?
Yeah. Just to add to that, Ron, I think some people still have the misconception that if they buy or purchase a grave space, that they are actually buying that piece of land. And yet the reality is you are buying the right to an interment there, the privilege of interment there, subject to the rules of the cemetery. You do not own that land. So you own the privilege to use it for a burial space. But you're right. A stone, a marker is still the personal property of the family. Many cemeteries take the responsibility of maintaining that. Some actually, like the Archdiocese, does set aside money in their endowed care fund. When a stone is placed, they set aside an amount for that goes into the fund so that they can maintain that stone in the future. And some of the more forward-thinking cemeteries do that.
We have one of our members, our committee members, Jamie Cosgrove, I think is back on now. Jamie, did you have any comments?
Thanks, Mike. I guess, just kind of following up on many of the comments I heard from the other members and getting to your original question at the beginning of, where do we go with this? And, I'm supportive of extending this to the fall. But I also do think we need to kind of focus on, what are some of the solutions? I've heard one of the members state, we don't have a carrot right now. There's not a carrot or a stick to address this issue. What complicates this, and not, it's been stated many times, is that many of these cemeteries fall under they're either neglected or as per the definition, which they're not under any direct control or jurisdiction of any active organization. But there are many that do fall under various organizations or the diocese or different as such. With that said, whatever, I know we want to give the people a place to voice their concern. I think we also have to be mindful of, or really play this out, if we establish and identify a state agency who would be the repository of these concerns, but what authority do we have, legal authority would those state agencies have to have, basically any influence in any way over certain organizations, right? I don't know if we can, if the legislature can enact any legislation where there's, in terms of telling for instance, a cemetery that may fall under the jurisdiction of the diocese, that they need to remedy a situation. So it'd be very complicated. And until we have those answers, or even if we were to find those answers, I think then we run into the situation, what is involved for a state agency to take on that obligation. I'm also, again, these are not, I think these are things that should be explored in terms of my next statements. I think we need to really look at the existing grant program that is there, the neglected cemetery grant, which is, as you said, administered through OPM. I think possibly looking at the expansion of that, and I believe the way it is funded currently is through a portion of the fees for death certificates that are filed. But I think to look at maybe expanding that, not only the scope of how that grant could be utilized for, but also maybe perhaps who's eligible to apply for that grant. One thing I think that would come out of this, and if we were to do that, then we may be able to get a better understanding of how large of an issue is this in terms of what are the resources needed. If you opened it up and expanded it, we may find out very quickly that this is a much larger issue, that there is many organizations and individuals and municipalities that are interested in addressing this issue. And once evaluating those requests, we can get an idea of how large in terms of this issue is, but also what are the resources that are needed to address this. So again, I'm not stating that's, should be the recommendation. I think these are things that need to be explored. And how realistic is it for us to implement something along those lines? Once again, we also run into the challenge too. I think what initially, how do you separate an individual issue? Right? For a family member or a concerned citizen or resident who goes to and they see the condition of a gravesite, and are they looking to have that address, that specific, or are we also trying to address if that's one issue, it probably exists throughout that particular cemetery. So I think there's a number of things that we got to kind of have to put them into categories, or I guess approaches, I think, in identifying. But I think getting back to your comment about focusing on solutions, I would be supportive of seeing if there's a way we can, expand the grant program. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we're at the point now, unless there's any other comments from our members. I'd like to open it up to public comment. If John and Maureen and John and Ron, any other comments before we do that? All right. So because we're in Hartford, I want to remind everybody, although we didn't do this the first couple of meetings, we're going to put a time limit on public comment, as happens here in Hartford and happens on these working groups and task force and commissions. So most of the time it's 3 minutes, but we're going to go to 10 minutes, 10-minute time limit per person who would like to speak. So Cheryl, are you on the line there? Okay. Anyone here? Public comment? Mr. Zach.
Am I there?
Oh, Cheryl's here. Mr.
Yeah.
Baldwin has left. Cheryl, thank you for joining us, and I'd like to turn it over to you. I mentioned that we have a time limit here, 10 minutes per public comment. So go right ahead.
Right. I don't know how many people there are familiar with my situation. I have family members, ancestors going back several generations buried at Park Cemetery. And for anyone who's familiar with what occurred at Park Cemetery, part of the reason for that criminality was due to a lack of oversight by the probate court at the time. There is a requirement to report, do an accounting report annually to the probate court regarding the perpetual care fund. And I haven't heard anybody mention the perpetual care fund, but a lot of the problems created in Park were due to the fact that the perpetual care fund was allowed to be dissipated by people who were not authorized to access it. And most perpetual care funds are set up so that you can access the interest, but not the principal. And the principal was invaded to the point where it has just finally disappeared. Park then became dependent on selling graves, which is the source of the other part of the criminality connected to Park Cemetery. And there are many veteran graves there going back to the Civil War. So it's a real tragic situation what happened there. My feeling has always been, and why I initially got involved, was because when I would return to the state of Connecticut, I would go to Park Cemetery to check on my family's grave sites, and there was a general decline in the condition, and it became just deplorable. I mean, the police department actually towed a stolen car out of the property right across from where my father is buried, and it was just. It's heartbreaking to even think back about what occurred there, but there has to be, and I like the idea of the Office of Consumer Protection, because I think that there needs to be definite oversight about the perpetual care funds, who's handling it, how much money is it. It should be made available to anyone purchasing a grave, that they know that there's a perpetual care fund that is well managed, that is well funded. Everyone who buys a grave contributes to it, and that it's used to maintain. I heard a lot of discussion about, the cutting the grass and removing trees, but it's Connecticut. You also have a winter problem. Are you going to say, well, if it snows, we're not going to plow in there. We're going to maintain it in the summer, but we're not going to maintain it in the winter. That works until you have to have a burial during the winter, or until, you've got families that say, well, we'd like to be able to visit our family's graves during the winter. So I know that the costs of maintaining a cemetery are far exceed what the grants are that you've been speaking about. It's very expensive to maintain a cemetery, and it's very difficult to find volunteers to do it. But I think the main problem is there needs to be something that needs to be taken out of the jurisdiction of the probate court as far as funding, overseeing the funding, and placed with what I think is a full-time, more responsible part of the Connecticut government. And that would certainly give a lot of peace of mind to those people who have buried their family, their loved ones at a cemetery in Connecticut. But as we know, there's a lot of movement in and out of states. People, may bury their parents, but they retire somewhere else, which is my case. And also, as generations move on, children may not be as interested or as keyed in to maintaining the graves of relatives that they never knew, never met, great-grandparents, great-parents beyond. So I really feel that there needs to start with the area of what agency outside of the probate court is now going to take over the responsibility of overseeing the funding of these perpetual care funds, perhaps how much. I heard something about, with each grave sold to a family, that, a percentage of that goes into a fund to maintain. And that's good. I think that's a great idea for, grave sites and cemeteries that are no longer active. And once they run out of land, they're not active anymore. There's no more graves to sell. And a lot of the older cemeteries, Park being one of them, is once they run out of land, that'll be the end of it. And without a perpetual care fund, it's going to be very difficult. Where's the responsibility for maintaining? I can't remember, I think it was 78 acres of graves, and a lot of them military veterans going back to the Civil War. where's the money going to come to maintain that? I don't think Bridgeport's in a position to ever be able to do that. I don't think the state of Connecticut's going to be in a position to not only do it for Park, but do it for the other cemeteries that are going to run out of space and no longer be able to sell graves. And without a perpetual care fund that's well managed, where everyone contributes, when you think about it, if you have a grave that was purchased back in the 1940s or 50s, 60s, whatever, and a perpetual care, the family paid into a perpetual care fund, that's a pittance compared to what it costs, today to keep the place maintained. And without having it well invested, it's not going to happen. And through my experience and what I knew about Park, I mean, there was $1 million or close to $1 million or a little over $1 million in the perpetual care fund, and that was completely depleted. So there is no money in a perpetual care fund. And as far as I know, there's no contributions currently being made into one. So the time is going to come when the cemetery has to close due to there's no more space to bury. And being an older cemetery as well, there are maintenance issues well beyond just cutting the grass and keeping the trees trimmed or removing limbs after a storm, that kind of thing. So the perpetual care fund, I think, is the place to start, funding them from the very beginning and having really well-managed oversight on the state level. I don't know if it'll be through the Attorney General's office, through the Office of Nonprofits, or through the Consumer Protection. I like Consumer Protection because they could also take complaints. The Attorney General's office, that I'm not so sure about. I didn't have very good luck with them, but yeah, I think there needs to be a lot of discussion about how are we going to oversee the funding that, for most cemeteries, they are well managed and there is funding there. And most of the managers of cemeteries I found to be compliant with what the rules were as far as reporting. But when you get into a situation like Park, where there was no reporting for decades, and then, all of a sudden there's no money there either. And that certainly was a big cause of the criminality that occurred there because they needed money to keep going. We need to think beyond just keeping the grass cut and grants. There's never going to be enough money in any grant program to take care of all of the cemeteries in Connecticut. If there's over 2,500, that's more than I had ever thought existed. And I agree, there's probably even more than that. So, I mean, that's where my hope is that Connecticut will look deeper than just, where are we going to find some grant money to cut the grass? Let's do something to really get the perpetual care funds to where they're well managed, and that there's oversight, and that there's good management in the cemeteries themselves. That they can't be there shouldn't be any part-time management. There should be full-time management, especially if they're open and they're still operating and they're still selling graves. And families who are purchasing graves should know that, there is a perpetual care fund, and what's in it and how long is it going to be able to take care of the graves that are there. If you're purchasing one, you definitely want to know that at some point in time, it's not going to become a neglected cemetery.
Okay, thank you very much, Cheryl.
Okay.
All right.
You're welcome.
Mr. Zach or Mr. Zach? Okay.
And that's what's going on. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. There is no accountability or a transparency. They were talking about the towns take over. The perpetual care funds should be able to do it. Okay, Two is, there was a discussion of volunteers. I'm surprised to hear that, because I was told many a times that they want Boy Scouts, the Lions Club, ASC to go there. Okay. Okay, now there's a discussion of liability. Okay, there's a contradiction there. I just want to bring that up. Okay, and again, it's a voice. Now that's all that this started off on. The co-chair, Carmen, Mr. Carmen, and First Selectman Frida. And I'll keep this short. It was brought to my attention of several things, and I contacted the Attorney General. Can both of you contact them because of what's going on in this work group, which is very good, coincides with what has been brought to my attention. And I think a representative from the Attorney General's office should be in a dialogue with both of you, the co-chairs. Okay, and I think you've got the letters. Okay, so I just want to bring that to your attention. No apologize to rush, but I just got 10 minutes in. The Carmen is here, but again, there is a contradiction that was stated today of to use volunteers, which I was told quite a few times. Okay, now they're saying it's not proper to do it. Okay, the DCP and the group has this. Is they have jurisdiction at grocery stores for $20. Okay. So the point I'm getting at is if they have the jurisdiction for $20 for groceries, and I think the veterans are much more important than $20. And I agree with Cheryl that there should be a voice. That's what I'm saying. No, then there's the 5 letters from a lieutenant colonel who is concerned about the conditions of the veterans' graves. And you're correct, sir, about different sections. But in perpetual care cemetery funds, okay, Joe. Okay, I just want to be sure. The veterans are commingled with all people and the veterans' wives too. So, and it just takes 35 seconds to clean or to clear one marker. I'm doing 20 right now, 20 that I should not be doing. 20 seconds or 30 seconds. The headstone is here. It's 7 feet to the marker. They clean around the headstone, but they can't take 5 steps to clear the marker for 30 seconds. It doesn't make sense to me. And again, it's not state funding or the towns to get involved at this point is perpetual care funds where the principles cannot be touched. But it is because there is no jurisdiction in transparency. Okay. And there is a contract here, which I have, and let's give it out to the whole group, that states a perpetual care fund contract. It states here under number 4 that the purchaser may contact the Department of Public Health. Okay. They do not have jurisdiction of the contract. So why do these contracts state that? Plus, if you look at this contract, it does not provide a telephone number either. Okay, there's different terminologies that could be used, but there is a problem here. Okay, with these contracts. Okay, and then last time that's serious right here. This contract stated here that to contact the Department of Public Health. And there's no telephone number here. Okay, and to go along with this, there's a very fine woman who went to a perpetual care cemetery and talked to some workers, and this a very fine woman was told that the manager heard about it and sent an email to the workers there. Do not contact that woman anymore. Okay, there's no voice. Okay, sir, this is the veterans right here. I brought up last time this copy of the letter of the opinion in the paper by Mrs. Piscatelli. And it states here that she went to St. Bernard Cemetery for help. Okay, and I'll give this out to you. There's a story about it here in the papers, and it's not so much about the story. Please read the comments. Okay, if I could tell you a story, a short story about Mrs. Piscatelli, and this is the veterans. Okay, this is very strong, and I apologize to say this, but I think the working group needs to know the facts, not debates or just the facts. Her father served in World War II. Okay, the war ended, but a sniper and the father was sitting on top of the tank, having a cigarette. A soldier, a sniper, killed him. Okay, and 3 others. It was done after the war. Probably the sniper did not know it, but this is the mother of a soldier that died, and this soldier's grave is covered with weeds. I got a problem with that. How people are treated. This is the state of Connecticut. These are veterans commingled with alls in a perpetual care cemetery. Okay, and it takes just 35 seconds. And Joe, I'll give that out to you. And the last, Mr. Frieda, I'm sorry, the first selectman, Frieda in the Coleman chair. There's letters here, which I will give out to the congressman people, the U.S. congressman. There's a comment made to me. This is a state issue. If I could bring to your attention, this is not a state issue. They serve for the United States of America. Okay, so if you could engage them to bring to their attention of what's going on with the veterans' graves. And I brought to the committee's attention the last time of these teenagers serving, okay? And then they were honored by a Congresswoman DeLauro. And then as a result of their sacrifices, their markers are covered with weeds. It's not a town issue at that stage. It's a perpetual care issue, okay? Now, I've got photos here, which I'll give to Joe to give out to you. Here's a photo of a, I don't know what this is called, but it's the falling against a grave, okay? Here's a state of Connecticut monument at St. Bernard Cemetery in honor of the veterans. It says here, a perpetual care. And I'll give this out to you. What I'm getting at is there is no voice. My parents, and there is more to it too. My parents had a contract about perpetual care, or has a contract. Okay, and I was 30 years old. Okay, I was asked or told to bring my contract in, and I asked why, because it's missing. They said, "Don't you have the record, the retention requirements?" Yeah, but I'm not going to use the word that it was told to me. But I'm being diplomatic and saying it's missing. And this place, the cemetery in, and I'm not going to name names, said they just have 25 to 30 contracts on file when there is over 10,000 people there. That's serious too. Okay. Now, on the contract for the perpetual care funds, I am not allowed, or no one is allowed to see how the funds are being invested. Cheryl is absolutely correct. Okay, so a person puts in $2,000 or $3,000. How is the money being invested? What's the status of the financial statements? There is no accountability or transparency. A court case is prepared for probate court. It hasn't been filed yet, but the question is, should it be filed? Okay, if I'm forced to do it, no, I will do it, but I believe that in the committee will do the right thing. Okay, and we're talking about voices. On July 2018, I asked for help for the veterans. Okay, that's simple. 6 years ago, okay, I was told there's one person in charge, a second person in charge, and cemetery manager. Okay, the second person in charge told me to go to the cemetery manager, and these are the facts. So I go, I drive from the headquarters, okay, to, I know, okay, to the headquarters, to the cemetery. The cemetery tells me I have no say. Go back to the second man in charge. 6 years of silence. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So what I do want, and I'm finished. If you could just contact Attorney General Tong for me, please.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Zach.
Okay.
Judge?
Rich, I think you have to be here.
Yes.
For the opportunity to speak to you. And before I begin, I want to thank those of you that are volunteers for taking on this task. This is this is an enormous task, and to be a volunteer is amazing. And I thank you as a resident of Connecticut. I made copies of some newspaper articles that involve Cheryl Johnson's experience with the courts. I asked your wonderful assistant over there, and he said you all have it. I want to make sure that you do have it because it's compelling. So as you know, my name is Carmen Lopez. I'm from Bridgeport. I'm an attorney by training. I served the state of Connecticut as a Superior Court judge for many years before I retired. How did I come into this whole issue of cemeteries? I have parents that I miss tremendously and have been buried in a Catholic cemetery in Trumbull, Connecticut. And many of the people, I'm one of those that makes frequent visits, used to. Now I've been so disheartened by the treatment that I haven't been going as frequently. But I have made many acquaintances of other people that are mourning and grieving their loss. As a result, we try to send correspondence and letters to see if we can get some relief for issues such as in a Catholic cemetery, some people that put up rosaries and they're removed, the water is turned off, those kinds of issues, maintenance issues, and of course the weeds and all of that. But what happened is that we were constantly told that informally, this wasn't officially in writing, it was a question of money. And so as a result of that, I started to look up the statutes, and I found all of this that both Cheryl and Ed Zach have been talking about, these perpetual care funds. And I found that the only remedy that I would have would be to go to the probate court and file a petition pursuant to General Statutes 19A-301. And I did that. And it was remarkable because the probate court didn't know anything about that. They said, oh my God, maybe we should be sending letters to cemeteries to file this. So I thought you'd be interested in knowing, and I know you know this already, that sunshine is the best disinfectant. And in my opinion and in my experience, and from what I've learned from Cheryl Johnson, and of course, Mr. Zach, who's the one that told me about you and got me involved in this, is that there's just no accountability. There's nobody looking out for what's happening with those perpetual care funds. I thought I would just read to you the statute. So there is a law in Connecticut, and it says that cemeteries shall file. The associations, whether they be ecclesiastical or otherwise or municipal, they need to have a meeting. They need to file those minutes in the probate court. And it needs to be signed by the treasurer. It isn't just anybody putting together, yeah, we made this, we made that. It has to be signed by the treasurer before July 1st of every year. They have to make that report. They have to state the income that they've received, to whom it has been paid, the amount and condition of the fund, and as Mr. Zach said, because he's a numbers guy, how is it invested? And I wish I could describe to you the resistance faced by me and this group of families that were bringing this to the probate court in Trumbull. First of all, the court didn't know anything about it. Even I took a good look at all the probate court rules of procedure. So it's as if what the state of Connecticut has done is say, okay, they sound good, they're in the law, but nobody's watching. And we know, because we live at a time now where all kinds of deceptive practices. That contract that Mr. Zach referred to, that's my contract. That contract says that a portion of the money that I paid to the cemetery was going to go into a perpetual care fund. And it also says that if there's any questions, I can call the Department of Public Health, which has no number there. But do you think that when you're going through a funeral, you're thinking about a perpetual care fund? And me as a lawyer, little tiny print, no, we're not. And so it seems to me that as wonderful as this is, because I know it's been a struggle in Connecticut to get any legislation that would create accountability. And we've got this working group. And as Mr. Shea has reminded us more than a few times, this is just to develop a process. Let's not get carried away here. It's just to develop a process. So in the meanwhile, I guess what people like me, I'm just a consumer. Mr. Zach is a consumer, and Cheryl. And your committee, I'm not sure which one of you is here as a representative of the consumers. But the consumers are looking for relief. And this may be beyond your scope. Okay, but the fact that we have nowhere to get accountability, that we get such resistance, that cemeteries are neglected, or in the case of Ms. Jansen, embezzled the funds, and there's no one to complain to. May I ask you to consider going to the legislators that appointed you to expand your inquiry? Somebody has got to be looking at that. I know that in the Diocese of Bridgeport, there's $10 million in a perpetual care trust fund. And none of this is being followed. And I checked in the Archdiocese of Hartford, and I know you, some of you, especially you, Mr. Shea, you're a cemetery official. You know the way they work. I don't, I'm just a consumer. But I would ask you seriously to look at that, to try to get the probate courts. If you're going to keep it with the probate courts, there's got to be something that makes them send a letter to the cemeteries. You got to report, you got to send this in so that we don't have to ask for a hearing. That's very simple to do, but nobody, they don't even know about it. So in my view, we talk about abandoned and neglected cemeteries, but I think we've abandoned and neglected the procedure to care. And you know what I did? I looked up the words of our governor. He said cemeteries, this is when you were talking about all that money that's going to be given out in grants. Cemeteries are sacred places, the governor said, and maintaining them is essential out of respect for the dead and preserving our local heritage. So it just seems to me that you that have been charged with this awesome responsibility, and again, I thank you for doing that if you could just consider some of those things, but there is money in some of those, not every cemetery, but in many of them. And you may want to consider that as you're thinking about grants and other things, and enforce the use of the probate court for reporting, so that people like me and other people, mourners, can at least find that out. All right. So I thank you for your attention and for everything that you're doing. I don't know if you have a question for me, and I've done tons of research on it, and I can try to answer some questions I have.
Judge, we have a question here.
Judge, do you happen to know in your research, why did this end up, why did the process as it is end up as a probate thing as opposed to some other regulatory? Do you have any idea of the history of it? I just don't know.
You know, it's funny because the statutes go back, this 19A 301 that I'm talking about, it was only Section A. And then about 20 years ago, the legislature went back and amended that statute, the one with the probates. And it was interesting because it added a Section B, C, and D. And that was about filing in the probate court and any interested party, it said. I would imagine, I mean, the probate court is a court of limited jurisdiction. They do things differently than the Superior Court. You know, remember, these individuals that serve as probate judges are elected. They're part-time. Frankly, I'll tell you what happened in my case. In Trumbull, we had our first hearing. All my little families came. And of course, the Catholic Church said, we're a church, that doesn't apply to us. So I did a whole memorandum of law. It does. I mean, there are things we can't get involved in doctrine, but we can certainly get involved in the way cemeteries are run or houses are run. The state has a right to do that as long as there's a secular, aspect to it. So after we got over that, all right, and then we were in the next one, and then the probate judge, who's an elected official, says, I'm going to have to disqualify myself. So why? He says, well, I'm a Catholic and I'm on the board of trustees of my church. And not only that, he says, I do work for the diocese. They hire me and I'm a contract attorney. Now, what does what does a person do with that? Now they want to try to find another judge. Now they're trying to, it's a terrible, I've been at this since last year. You may wonder, why didn't you recuse yourself at the beginning? That's your issue. But as a consumer, again, just look at me like that. Someone who's mourning and tried to spend so much to make my mother and father's grave and all my cousins and everybody. And to be treated like this is really terrible. So why they did it with the probate court, I don't know. I don't know. But I do think that that effort that the state of Connecticut tried in 1994 with the an act to create a cemetery board within the Department of Consumer Protection. It was a very good bill, but it didn't make it. I know that there are strong lobbying efforts against accountability. That's my opinion. Don't get mad at me, Mr. Shea. You already got mad at me over here when I told you that. There's a strong resistance to accountability from cemeteries. And as a person who served the state as a judge, I have come across the powerful forces at work in the legislature and the judicial and all of that. Sadly, I've experienced some of them. So I don't know. I don't know who they are. I have some ideas, but it's a tough, tough lobby group. Otherwise, this would have been done. Why didn't the law pass in 1994? Why did the first bill that you tried to get through didn't pass? The one that passed is this one that creates a group, and as we're reminded, to create a process, but to really deal with the problem, to create a process. So inquiring minds want to know.
Judge John has a question.
Oh,
Judge,
yes.
First, thank you for your service to our state.
Oh, thank you.
There are several statutes. Unfortunately, as we know, the way the legislature puts these in the books, they're in separate places.
Mhm.
But there's two very specific statutes. One is 368J
Well,
about,
that's the chapter.
yeah, but it's about filing the state and federal tax returns, and also that with the probate court where you can petition to get that information. And then there's section 19A 301
That's the one I just
that you're
received.
familiar with
Uh-huh.
about concerning the endowed care funds, the rules of the trustees, and those have been there. They're on the books.
Well, no, that's how.
And that's a part of the issue, I'm sure, where some of the cemeteries, have ceased to kind of follow those things because.
Nobody enforces them.
Right.
Right, sir, because look at I followed the law. I wrote a letter first to the probate court. And I said, pursuant to this statute, it says a report needs to be filed in your court. Please consider this a request for that report. If there's a fee, let me know. And they said, we don't have any report here. And then informal conversations, we didn't even know about this. It's okay, then here's my petition. So I drafted a petition. And I filed it, and they were kind enough to schedule a hearing. But then the esteemed and powerful Catholic Church said, this doesn't apply to us. We're the church. And then they gave them time. And then they ultimately, in chamber, said, no, I know it applies to us. Now, is that the way for us to want to treat the people of Connecticut? I don't know. But I'm familiar with the statutes. There's also one that considers if cemeteries are charitable causes, there's that statute 47(1) that talks about charitable entities, including the burial in cemeteries. And then when you look over to the duties, this is what Mr. Zach, I think, was trying to say, when you look over to the duties and responsibilities of the Attorney General, he's got to represent the people when it comes to those areas that are considered charitable. So I don't know. I have not made any contact myself, but I know Mr. Zach, who's a tireless advocate, has sent me copies of the letters that he has sent. He's been ignored. So the Attorney General, they ignore. He's got a lot of patience. So I don't know what the problem is, but I know that you are close to political power because powerful people appointed you to this board so that you could use that influence and that power to maybe get some release for we the people, So, and if you have any other questions, you have my email and I'm happy to share all my research. I've done so much. I'm happy to share it with you if you'd like something on that, or just be of support if I can.
Well, Judge, I would like you to consider, if you would, sending us how you would recommend or how you would propose our recommendations to the state.
Okay. Yeah, it involves a lot because you have to think of the probate courts.
Right.
I'm sure that those, you have to deal with the Judiciary Committee, right? Whenever you're dealing with the courts.
Mhm.
And yeah. Well, if you ever just want to, I'm happy to do that, but if you ever just want to have like an informal chat about that, I'm happy to do that too. But I'll start thinking about it.
Because
Okay.
the way this will work, I've chaired a lot of these groups in the past, different categories. I said it earlier, we don't have any authority right now,
I know.
but once we submit recommendations, then it goes into the House of Representatives and the Senate. 154 roughly in the House, 30, I think 6 in the Senate. And then it's out of our control at that point.
I
So
know.
we've got to make the best effort to submit the most vibrant and the most game-changing recommendations we can. We've got only one chance at this to do that.
Well, Miss Jansen, who, after I read all that stuff in the paper and I reached out to her in court, and look what happened to her. She went to probate court under that statute. And the probate judge in Bridgeport, who is Judge Ganem, all right, decided to go into Superior Court and file his own lawsuit, representing himself, the probate court, and basically put together a new committee, leaving the families out. So that's a big thing. What are we going to do? I'm happy to go into that area, but I think that it's an interesting, secretive process. And I'm glad that you have all that experience dealing with this, with commissions and things like that, because they're hard. I was on a lot of commissions myself before I became a judge. Judicial selection, I was on a lot of commissions. They're hard. You got a charge to do, and then you got this one that wants it, that one that doesn't want it. It's tough negotiating.
And you mentioned earlier about I think you said powerful lobbyists, right?
Yes.
So this is what happens here in this
Oh, I
building.
know.
So I want to reiterate one more time, if you don't mind, everybody. We're charged with developing a process. We got to make it the best possible process in terms of language we can. Once we submit it, we're out of it.
I know.
Then it goes to the Senate, the House, and then under the scenario you mentioned, Judge, then the lobbyists get involved,
They do.
and they're many times very influential.
Look at the gentleman that I just met, Mr.
Right.
Evans. He's a lobbyist for the Cemetery Association.
Mhm.
He's got more say than I do.
Yep.
I think that's how he introduced him. Did I say his name wrong?
No, he's not currently a lobbyist for the Cemetery Association.
Oh, I'm sorry. He gave me his card and he described, I'm sorry. I don't mean to say things that aren't true, but I know how that works. I wrote an article once about the making of law, how you compare it to making sausages. And I actually did the whole thing. I went to a sausage factory and I looked at it and I thought it was much more transparent to watch sausages being made than law. So I know what you're saying, but I stand here or sit here ready to be of support if I can to you.
Thank
And I know Ms. Jensen, she's had incredible experience. She's offered to be supportive and she's a trained attorney as well.
Mhm.
And of course, Mr. Zach, who can beat that? He's the Energizer Bunny.
Thank you very much, Judge.
All right, thank you
Thank
for
you.
your
Okay,
attention.
Thanks.
All
All right, we have to wrap this up, Ed. Okay, so yes.
That states, the state of New York has in practice specific laws including segregation through regulation of potential care funds. The principle of a potential care fund is restricted to the United States. Currently, there is no transparency.
Any other comments? John, Maureen, Ron, or John?
Just as I said, I mean, the statutes are on the books. They're not being enforced. So that's gotta be an issue for us too.
Okay, and that will be part of our recommendation to enforce the statutes, along with other recommendations that we come up with. Very good. All right, hearing no other comments, I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? Second, all those in favor? All right, thank you.